Yo, what's good, Shinobi Nation? Welcome back to Just a Shinobi, the home of the craziest Naruto what-ifs. Today we're jumping into part 5 of What If Naruto Says I Am Not Going to Puberty Again. So strap in, because things are about to get explosive. If you're new to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video with your whole ninja squad. And of course, drop your theories in the comments. Your support is what keeps this Shinobi grinding. Hey! Watch where you're putting those hands of yours, Nana-chan. But I can't help it, Mitsu. Just look at these babies. How do you do it? I hear soy, fish, and dairy products are good for them. That, and regular massages. Oh, and Mitsu's got that handsome boyfriend to give her nice and thorough rubdowns, doesn't she? Lucky thing. It's not like that, Nana. KRW, we're not one of those couples. Oh, you're blushing. You're totally blushing. Splash. I am not. You're just seeing things. Splash, splash. Kya. Ritzy, you jerk. Watch where you're putting your hands. A large, white-haired man giggled to himself, setting down his spyglass to jot some quick notes in a messy shorthand, before picking the eyepiece back up and resuming his perverted espionage. He was perched on a cliff overlooking a small lake where a few attractive young women in itty-bitty swimsuits were enjoying a day to themselves, giggling as they splashed each other in the shallows and indulged in stereotypical fan service and skinship. Jiraiya of the Sannin watched intently as the young women played and cavorted, showing off their curves with tight, skimpy bikinis. He drooled a little bit as he watched them jiggle and bounce, their bosoms seemingly threatening to break loose of those cruelly snug confines. His notepad was filled with sketches and observations, 3 pages so far, just from watching these girls. Women abroad were fine and dandy, but it seemed that nothing could beat his hometown hotties. With a toothy grin and a dopey expression, Jiraiya paused in his observations to scribble down a couple more notes in his personal shorthand, indecipherable to anyone but himself and his students, another giggle escaping his lips as the shorter brunette slipped her hands up the more buxom raven-haired beauty's bikini top. The lankier, skinnier, sandy-haired one with the frilly skirt-like bottom tittered and jeered teasingly at her friends. Silently, Jiraiya thanked the powers that be for allowing him this veritable goldmine of inspiration. And to think, he probably wouldn't have come back to the Leaf at this time if he hadn't gotten news that his godson was participating in the Chunin exams. I'll have to thank the kid for giving me an excuse to come back into town, Jiraiya mused. If it looks like he can handle it, maybe I'll give him some lessons on the basics. If he has access to even half as much chakra as his mother, or if he has even the slightest fraction of his old man's ingenuity, then Naruto ought to take to my lessons like a fish to water. And speaking of fish in water, it seemed that the raven-haired beauty had lost her top, and was now wrestling the brunette's bottom off in retaliation. The dirty blonde was laughing her nice and perky ass off. A bit of blood trickled from Jiraiya's nostrils. He licked his lips and resumed furiously scribbling down notes. Yes, returning to Konoha when he did was probably one of the best decisions he had made in quite a while. If he was really lucky, he might even find a pretty young hankering to get down with a legendary shinobi. Maybe next I'll check out the hot springs, he mused. Jiraiya had a good feeling about today. Congratulations, you 3. You've officially progressed to the 3rd stage of the exams, Kakashi said to his students as he led them back out of the forest of death, running through the treetops at a leisurely, by their standards, pace. You've done very well so far. Naruto and Sakura smiled at the compliment. Even this time around, with their abilities as high as they were, Kakashi rarely doled out any significant praise. He wasn't the sort of teacher to carelessly feed his students' egos. Sasuke, however, could hardly care less about praise from the copy ninja. Of course we have, he drawled, looking askance at their Jounin sensei. You've seen how good we are, Kakashi. Frankly, these exams are beneath us. At least until we have to fight each other, Sakura interjected. Then it'll probably become a real challenge. Naruto grinned, a faraway look in his eye. He stroked his chin thoughtfully and glanced sidelong at his male teammate. It's been a while since me and Sasuke have had a real all-out match, he commented. I can't wait to fight him seriously in the finals. Sakura shot him a warning glare. Not in that stadium, you don't, she reprimanded. Please try to think of the potential collateral damage before you act, Naruto. If you and Sasuke were to fight at full power inside the village boundaries, she trailed off, before shaking her head and favoring the blonde with a smirk. But well, that aside, Sasuke will have to get through me or Hinata before you can fight him, anyways. Naruto laughed good-naturedly. Ah, true. Him and I are on opposite ends of the tournament bracket, aren't we? We are, Sasuke said, his expression neutral. More's the pity, really. You get one less fight than me. I wouldn't count your eggs before they hatch, Kakashi interjected. You can never be sure how a match might turn out, and if you go into the fight too cocky, you're very liable to overreach yourself and make a stupid mistake. Sasuke rolled his eyes. Do you really think any of us are actually likely to lose our fights? He scoffed. No. Probably not, the copy ninja admitted blithely, shrugging. But you can never be too cautious. I'd contest that, and say that a certain degree of recklessness is needed to do well in battle, but I really don't care, Sasuke flippantly responded. Turtling is for people who can't effortlessly dismantle their opponent with just a glance. Sakura laughed. How typical of you, Sasuke, she said wryly, patting him affectionately on the shoulder. I suppose you'll continue fighting with a handicap in the finals? You know he only whips that out for serious opponents, Naruto quipped. Like when we fought Zabuza on the way to Wave. And even then it was total overkill, honestly. Kakashi tiredly shook his head, remembering the incident in question. He dropped to a lower elevation in the branches, jumping nimbly through the titanic foliage of Training Ground 44. Despite the speed at which he was moving, not his maximum by any means, but still fast enough to leave most other ninja panting and wheezing in the dust, his cute little genin was matching his pace perfectly, and showing few if any signs of exertion. These kids really were in a whole other league from their peers. Ah, yes, Kakashi said absent-mindedly. By the way, do try not to go overboard, okay? It would look bad to the other sensei if any of my students killed their students. We won't kill anyone, Sakura said promptly. Not unless they try to kill us first. And even then, only if they actually pose a threat of successfully doing so, which is pretty dang unlikely, in my opinion. She smiled, absent-mindedly punching her way through a tree. Not for any real reason, mostly just because it was there, and she felt like showing off. So she struck the trunk with a small, bare fist, smashing through the wood with laughable ease. The upper segment of the tree teetered for a moment, the remaining area around the gaping hole quite insufficient to support its weight, before falling to the forest floor with a crash. Gah! Timber! Naruto called up behind them, sidestepping the falling mass of wood. You gotta shout out timber when you're going to be knocking trees over, Sakura. That's the rule, remember? The pinkette pouted cutely at the blonde. Ah, but there wasn't anyone around to get hurt by it, she replied in a sugary tone. I was there, Naruto deadpanned. So was I, added Sasuke, a touch miffed. Anyone who could be hurt by it, Sakura corrected, dropping the cutesy act and rolling her eyes. The two boys shared a look, then shrugged in unison. Fair enough, Sasuke said. I can take much bigger wood than that without going down. Naruto sniggered, and Sakura giggled. Even Kakashi found himself biting back a chuckle. These kids are a bad influence on me. They're making my sense of humor more immature than ever, thought the man who had a jutsu that was literally just a glorified kancho. Sasuke gave the other three a black look. Oh, haha. Very funny, he muttered. Real mature, you guys. I didn't say a thing, said Sakura angelically. And I'm sure you've gone down on much bigger wood, Naruto added cheekily, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. Sasuke shot back with a rather vulgar gesture, and a curse too foul to be transcribed. Language, boys, Kakashi lazily reprimanded. We don't want people thinking I'm a bad influence on you, do we? You are a bad influence, though, Sasuke replied archly. I don't see anyone else reading smut in public. That's just because I'm not of age yet, Sakura interjected, waving a hand airily. Well, physically, at least, she added mentally a second later. But you know full well what kind of reading habits I really have, dear. Sasuke couldn't actually hear Sakura's thoughts or anything like that, but he could still roughly tell what she was thinking by reading the look on her face. He glowered. You know what I mean. Kakashi shook his head and sighed. It was either that or chuckle. The kids could be terrifying when they got serious, but more often than not they tended to just joke around and pull each other's chains, didn't they? It's mature literature with love scenes, he drawled, glimpsing a light at the edge of the woods. You'll appreciate it when you're older, I'm sure. Sasuke rolled his eyes, but he didn't say anything to this. What do you think we should do about training for the final phase? Naruto mused, having a go at changing the subject. I'd been meaning to ask you about that, sensei. Well, that's a good question. You three seem to have the basics down pat, Kakashi hummed thoughtfully. Plus, you've also shown plenty of ingenuity with your techniques. I do have a couple ideas. Mind you, not that I'm really obligated to teach the three of you new jutsu or anything, but I reckon you kids are ready for the next level. In terms of skill, at the very least. They burst out of the foliage, landing in front of one of the gates in the fence encircling the forest of death. Kakashi reached a hand into his vest, casually producing 3 small pieces of paper. Channel some chakra into these, he said, as they walked to the gate. It'll show your elemental affinity. Not that I expect you kids to be able to master nature transformation in only a month's time, but it'll provide a decent foundation as far as what sort of jutsu will come easier to you. He handed 1 slip each to Sakura, Sasuke, and Naruto. With mildly amused expressions, the trio promptly did as Kakashi requested. Sakura's paper moistened, then crumbled. Sasuke's moistened, crinkled, split in half, crumbled, and burned. Naruto did nothing for a second. Then, just when Kakashi was about to ask if the blonde was sure he was following the instructions correctly, the slip of paper flashed, shining like a 1,000-watt light bulb in the boy's hand, before exploding into a shower of multicolored sparks. Kakashi blinked. Well, alright then, he muttered weakly, quite bemused by this development. Who wants to head to the onsen for a break? The trio smiled innocently before nodding in unison. Tsunade woke up to a shaft of sunlight stabbing through her eyelids. She saw nothing but a blinding reddish mist that chased away the quiescent black of dreamless sleep, a dull and throbbing pain seeming to radiate outward from her optical nerves. Her lips felt dry and cracked. Her mouth might as well have been stuffed full of cotton gauze laced with the bitter, acid taste of cheap booze and vomit. Her ears were ringing and her head was throbbing, and her bladder felt ready to burst. The world-renowned medic groaned and rolled over on her futon, trying to squeeze her eyes more tightly shut against the intruding, unwelcome solar luminescence. Her joints were stiff and sore, her back shooting with occasional bursts of pain. Aching, ill-used muscles protested even the slightest degree of movement. For a moment, Tsunade dared to hope that if she closed her eyes and ignored all of this, she might somehow manage to fall back asleep and win a few more hours of respite from the unrelenting misery of consciousness. The pressure in her bladder refused to leave her mind, however, and her gut chose to rumble ominously a few seconds later. Muttering a virulent oath, Tsunade reluctantly pushed herself up off of the futon. Still wearing the clothes she had fallen asleep in, stale and smelling of bile and liquor, the legendary sucker groaned and rose to her feet, feeling bones creak and joints crack. She staggered clearly in the direction of the bathroom. After taking care of business and doing a quick wash, rinsing her face and brushing her teeth, she finally bothered to check the time. It was 3:30. In the afternoon. Ugh. That was a hell of a night, the woman groaned, feeling half again as old as she actually was. She rubbed her eyes, which felt dry and vaguely itchy. Blee. I'm seriously getting too old for this crap. Sighing, Tsunade left the bathroom in search of a clean change of clothes. It took her a moment to find her things. She couldn't really remember checking into this inn, and the layout was a little different than she was used to. She found Shizen's clothes before her own, actually, and this led her to wonder just where her apprentice might have gotten to. She'll probably be doubly insufferable today, the lush thought ruefully as she passed over the raven-haired woman's bag and came to her own. Considering how late I've slept in. She pinched the bridge of her nose, feeling her headache intensify. Fuck. I must have had a lot to drink last night. Shizen was usually fairly deferential to her master, especially since the woman might as well have been her aunt, but that didn't mean she never expressed disappointment with Tsunade's lifestyle. While she rarely said as much outright, Shizen rather disapproved of drinking and gambling, and could even become something of a nag if pushed far enough. They were as good as family, and this meant the apprentice medic was one of the few people who could get away with busting Tsunade's balls over her bad habits, so to speak. Finally coming across a serviceably clean change of clothes, Tsunade peeled off her crusty and stinking garments. She paused for a moment, debating whether to take a bath now or get dressed and wait until she didn't feel so ungodly horrible. Most of her being just wanted to lie back down on the futon and wait for the hangover to pass. Even getting dressed felt almost like it would be more trouble than it was worth. But Shizen would probably have a conniption if she came back to find her mentor sleeping in the nude, and Tsunade really didn't feel like getting a lecture from the girl. Not with a headache this bad. So, with a long-suffering sigh, the slug princess barely dressed herself. As she pulled up her pants, she absently tried to remember where she was. It was a futile effort, though. The last town she could actually remember the name of, the last time she'd been sober enough to commit as much to memory, had probably been a few days ago, at the very least, and who knew how far she might have wandered in the meantime. Drowsily shaking her head, Tsunade fumbled with her blouse for a moment or two. Now that she'd been up for a little while, she was starting to regain her equilibrium and managing to shunt aside the discomfort of the hangover. Learning when and how to ignore pain was a critical element of shinobi discipline, and Tsunade wasn't considered a living legend for no reason. Finally, she was dressed, and in enough control of her faculties to wonder once again where Shizen might have gotten to. Perhaps the girl had found herself a nice guy to shack up with for the night? It would probably do her good, but Tsunade doubted that this was the case. More likely Shizen was busy doing odd jobs to try and recoup a portion of her mentor's losses. Tsunade might have been, but her apprentice had no such hang-ups, and she was a good enough medic besides to handle most sorts of injuries and ailments. So, basically, the girl could be anywhere in the town. Which was troublesome, since Tsunade didn't even know what town this was. Sighing, she shook her head and decided to find out if this place had an onsen. She could always look for Shizen later, and the thought of a nice hot soak was growing too tempting to ignore. So she put away her things and headed in the most likely direction of the front desk. Temari was sore, grumpy, and tired as she stumbled out of the room she and her brothers were sharing for the duration of their stay in the village, at one of Konoha's nicer inns. It was one of those places with a hot spring, natural or otherwise, she didn't care, and the blonde fully intended to take advantage of this particular amenity. Water wasn't especially scarce in Suna. The village was built above a decently sized aquifer, you see, and the surrounding oasis locations were well documented, but bathing was still a luxury, and one in which even the Kazekage's daughter could only rarely indulge. The hidden leaf had water to spare though, so Temari was not about to turn down the chance to enjoy a nice onsen. It wasn't by a long shot, but Konoha was still said to have some damn nice springs. Practically melting already at the thought of getting to immerse herself in the hot, steaming mineral water, Temari was naturally a little distracted from looking where she was going. So much so, in fact, that she wound up walking face first into someone's chest. A very buxom someone's chest. "Afst Murphle!" Temari yelped, eyes going wide when they were suddenly assaulted by a soft and creamy expanse. She felt her cheeks burn, and for a brief moment she froze. Then, anxiously, the lass extricated her face from the stranger's cleavage, looking away and fighting the urge to blush. She couldn't bring herself to meet the woman's eyes, she felt so mortified. Sorry, miss," she said at length, sheepishly scratching the back of her neck. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "No problem, kid," the woman replied, her words coming out the slightest bit slurred. "Just tell me if this place has a hot spring, and we'll call it even." Temari blinked owlishly at this. Yes," she said in spite of herself, managing to turn her head and lift her gaze to meet the woman's eyes. She straightened up and recomposed herself. "It does. I was just heading there now, in fact." "Oh, that's good. You can show me where they are, then." Temari inwardly grimaced at this. Her cheeks still felt a bit warm from embarrassment over that collision, and she really wanted nothing more than to put some distance between herself and this woman and forget that it had ever happened, but she couldn't quite bring herself to backtrack now. "Sure, I suppose so," she reluctantly said. She took in the stranger's brown eyes, blonde pigtails, and large tracts of land. Then she noticed the strange blue diamond mark on the woman's forehead. Oddly, Temari got the damnedest feeling that she should know who this person was. "Hey, what are you guys doing here?" Kiba glowered at Naruto and Sasuke, the Inuzuka halfway through undressing when the pair walked into the changing room. Neither boy spared him a second glance, simply grabbing a couple clean towels before starting to take off their own clothes. They're probably here to use the hot springs, Shino blandly deduced, his pale skin pockmarked with many minuscule, scarcely noticeable boreholes. Why else would they come in here? They might try to peep on Hinata, Kiba protested, scowling. I bet they heard Kurenai-sensei was treating our team at the hot springs and decided to come over and perv on them. Sasuke rolled his eyes. We didn't even know your team was here until you said that, idiot, he said. For all Naruto and I knew, you and Shino just came here of your own accord. Not quite true, Naruto corrected his teammate, unzipping his trousers. I'd already sensed their chakra before we even entered the building. He paused, then, looking off into the distance for a moment, before adding, and speaking of which, actually, I think Sakura and Hinata must be saying hello. They're standing right next to each other, and it feels like they're talking. Kiba's scowl darkened. Humph. Just don't try anything funny, you got that? He muttered, eyeing the pair suspiciously. I don't want either of you creeps peeping on them. I don't peep, said Sasuke scornfully. Such juvenile chicanery is beneath me. And I don't really have to peep, added Naruto helpfully. Sexy jutsu, remember? I can make my shadow clones look like anyone. He then laughed. Not that I've ever actually done that, of course. He added with a jovial wink. You haven't? Said Kakashi, choosing now to come meandering into the changing room after his students. Well, that seems like a waste of a clever technique. Sasuke snorted. Naruto laughed. Shino didn't do anything of particular note. Kiba grumbled a bit, unamused, but he seemed to relax somewhat at the sight of an apparent authority figure. Perhaps he thought Kakashi would be a responsible adult and make sure none of the kids tried to peep through the divider, or else that the Jounin's presence would deter his students from any untoward activity. Whatever the case, he hung up his clothes and wrapped a towel around his waist. Your sensei treating you here? He ventured to say after a moment, addressing Naruto and Sasuke without actually looking in their direction. He had no way to know what stage of undressing they were at, and no desire to get a sudden eyeful. Something like that, came Sasuke's voice, the words spoken lazily. His tone was unconcerned. Yeah, pretty much, Naruto agreed. His voice was closer, and a second later the blonde walked ahead of Kiba, heading towards the door. And I guess that means Kurenai-sensei is doing the same? Right, Kiba nodded. I think she figured we deserved a reward for doing so well in the prelims. Sasuke stepped forward, now, with a condescending smirk on his face. I think it's rather sad that you see landing even one hit on your opponent as doing well, he said. Had any trouble sitting down recently, Uchiha? Kiba retorted, glowering. Sasuke scowled for a fraction of a second before smirking. I could ask your sister the same thing, Inuzuka. Kiba's face went maroon, and he grit his teeth. One could have been forgiven for thinking that sparks had begun to fly between the pair's eyes, with the intensity of Kiba's glare bordering on downright lethal. Sasuke was subtler in his distaste, but it was clear from the way he looked at the other genin, with a lofty and disinterested sort of contempt, that he thought of the other boy as being singularly beneath him. This unspoken dismissal chafed Kiba like leather underwear in an August marathon, raising his hackles and making him long to let one fly and knock the so-called Uchiha prodigy down a few pegs. He probably would have done something about it, too, if not for the voice that broke in on their stare-down. Be nice now, boys, Kakashi boredly interjected, walking past them in a towel of his own, a washcloth wrapped around the lower half of his face. He gave his student a look. Don't get all snippy just because Akamaru bit you, Sasuke. Really, that was just your own fault for letting your guard down. Sasuke scowled at this comment, and for a moment the look in his eyes made it seem like he would continue antagonizing Kiba just to spite his sensei. But then he stopped and shook his head, giving the Inuzuka one last dismissive look, before turning and following Naruto out into the hot spring. Kiba reluctantly stood down, muttering under his breath about insufferable pricks, before heading out into the open-air bath as well. Shino sighed and shook his head long-sufferingly. Akamaru was busy being pampered by Hana back at the Inuzuka kennels. What sort of training do you plan on doing for the finals, Hinata? Sakura's question was not spoken very loudly, but neither were the words vocalized with any particular quietness. It was a perfectly innocent and casual inquiry, the kind of talk that wouldn't draw more than a single cursory glance from the other patrons. Hinata sank into the water, leaning her back against the fence which divided the men's and women's sides of the hot spring. She smiled idly as the Pinkette took a spot beside her, a spot which just so happened to be right in front of a small, almost unnoticeable hole in the wood. There weren't too many people here, the time being scarcely 4 in the afternoon, and aside from her, Sakura, and Kurenai-sensei there were only a couple other women in the water. Do you mean aside from general physical conditioning? She wondered, smiling blissfully as she melted into the water. I don't know, but I've considered working on my. I still can't shape the chakra on that one quite as quickly as I would like, you see, but then, there are also a couple other moves I've been conceptualizing. Neat, Sakura hummed drowsily, sinking a little further into the water. Anything interesting? Well, I do have an idea for sort of forming a fireball with my hands and shooting it out with a palm thrust, Hinata said, but it's pretty tricky, and I haven't made much progress. Really, it's mostly just a theoretical exercise at this stage. Too bad, Sakura said, chuckling lazily. I would have liked to see you tossing around some new moves in the final phase. Hinata giggled, patting Sakura on the shoulder. What about you? She queried. I'm sure you won't be sitting idly by while your teammates train themselves raw. True. Sakura laughed high and clear, earning her a dirty look from a familiar sandy blonde at the other end of the spring, Temari of Suna, whose middle brother Sakura had quite soundly defeated in the preliminaries. Yes, well, you know me. Kakashi-sensei is planning to have us start on chakra nature transformation, I think, but as for my personal training, I'll probably just be working on my medical ninjutsu and practicing my chakra control. You know, to try and squeeze a little bit more power out of my punches. Another blonde, older and more buxom than Temari, perked up the tiniest bit at this. Hinata noticed, and she smiled inwardly. I can hardly fathom how you could punch any harder than you already do, Sakura, the Hyuga lass said demurely, watching for the older woman's reaction. Your strength is already just monstrous, to be absolutely frank. Sakura shrugged. It's the difference between reducing someone to a chunky salsa and turning them into a fine paste, really, the Pinkette said. But you never know what sort of nigh indestructible freaks might be out there. More likely than not, I'll need every newton of punching power I can muster, one day. Probably, Hinata conceded, smiling genially. But I think your medical ninjutsu is a more valuable skill in the long run. Who else will keep Naruto and Sasuke from dying of combat injuries if not you? Hee. Perhaps, said Sakura with a knowing smile. She waved a hand airily and winked. Those two truly are hopeless without someone there to patch up their wounds. Her smile sharpened, then, and emerald eyes gleamed. Speaking of the boys, by the way, has Naruto invited you to that family reunion he's got planned yet? Sasuke's already invited me to his, she added, puffing out her chest and grinning wider. But of course he has, Hinata said gracefully. He's very eager to meet his family, you know, since he didn't really have anyone there for him growing up. The blonde woman from earlier twitched a tiny bit at this comment. True, both our boys are poor, sad orphans, aren't they? Sakura giggled. I suppose that's why they need our tender affections to make their lives worthwhile. Oh, really now? Hinata splashed Sakura, laughing. Are you sure you weren't the one mooning over Sasuke ever since your early days in the academy? Look at the pot calling the kettle black, said Sakura loftily, poking a finger into Hinata's side. Like you've never used that Genkai to get a peek of your crush in the buff. Hinata smiled demurely. I'm sure I have no idea what you are talking about, Sakura, she replied, reclining a little more against the divider. Are you sure all this steam isn't going straight to your head? So you're saying you've never peeped on a boy you liked? Sakura teasingly inquired. Ever? Of course not, said Hinata primly. Sakura smirked, her eyes twinkling. She turned so that her side was to the fence, and she peeked at the small, innocuous knothole which rested roughly at her eye level. With a playful expression, she drew Hinata's attention to the opening. You don't feel even remotely tempted to scope out any of the cute guys who may or may not be on the other side of that fence? She whispered, waggling her eyebrows. Not even the tiniest bit? Not at all, Hinata assured her friend. Sakura laughed. Well then, I guess that just means all the more for me, Red Heart, she chirped. And after saying this, the pinkette promptly turned and put her eye to the knothole, a rather lecherous grin adorning her lips. A second later, she pouted. Ah, darn. All I see is an eye. This statement, unlike most of the rest of their conversation, was loud enough to be heard by the rest of the patrons. On the other side of the fence, Shino was dragging an unconscious Kiba out of the water. Naruto was pinning Sasuke to the spot with a stern look, deterring the Uchiha from trying to succeed where the Inuzuka had failed. Please don't kill my godfather, that look said. And Sasuke, despite his indignation at the thought that the Toad Sage might even now be getting an eyeful of his wife's naked form, regardless of the fact that Jiraiya would rather be focused on any mature patrons who might be in the women's side of the hot spring, reluctantly acquiesced to Naruto's wish. Kakashi wasn't stupid enough to try and get between Jiraiya and his research. Shino was too busy making sure his insensate friend didn't drown, and the few other male patrons seemed largely indifferent. Naruto was patient, and besides that he could feel Sakura's chakra on the opposite side of the fence, most likely blocking any view Jiraiya might want to get with the back of her head. So he didn't feel any need to act just yet. If Hinata was in any danger of being peeped on, then he might jump in and give the old pervert what for, but for now he just wanted to sit there and appreciate the fact that his former mentor was honest to God, truly and sincerely alive. Right there in front of him. Also, he knew it was only a matter of time until Jiraiya was caught. Sakura was of course aware of the man's presence. Naruto had informed her the instant he realized that the onsen they were going to happen to be the current location of a chakra signature that could only have belonged to his godfather, with its size and density and minutest, oily trace of intermingled natural energy. Sakura probably just wanted to enjoy her bath a bit before actually calling the man out, not that saying this would have calmed Sasuke, or have stayed Kiba from his doomed attempt to kick the peeping Tom's ass. So Naruto sat, soaked, and waited. Once Jiraiya had been forcibly torn from his research, then he would approach the man about training him for the Chunin exams. If all else failed, he could just play up the resemblance to his parents, and guilt-trip the old ninja into teaching him. At that moment, a twinge of visceral, reflexive panic reached the blonde's empathic senses. His ears perked up, and he listened more closely to what was being said on the women's side. All I see is an eye. Naruto chuckled then, moments later, feeling the swell of righteous anger from a very familiar chakra. Jiraiya! He thought he, recognizing Tsunade's furious roar. Nice to have you back, Granny. The onsen all but exploded, and Jiraiya let out a most unmanly shriek as the fence flew straight into his face. But I should probably rescue Pervy Sage before you put him 6 feet under. With that weary thought, Naruto grabbed the Toad Summoner's arm and drew up a minuscule sliver of Kurama's chakra. In a flash of gold light, he and Jiraiya vanished. Kakashi blinked owlishly, even as he and the remaining men present stared in a mixture of terror, awe, and fascination as a livid Tsunade stormed heedless of decency across the point where the divider had stood only a second before. Startled bathers on both sides ducked low into the water, abashed of being seen naked by the opposite sex. Only Tsunade seemed unconcerned, whipping her gaze over the men's half of the bath for several seconds, searching for her perverted former teammate. The more lecherous bathers on the men's side sent up prayers of gratitude, while the saner ones prayed for mercy. Tsunade threw her head back and howled to the heavens in her rage. Jiraiya! She bellowed. I am going to kill you! The instant Jiraiya saw that bright green eye looking back at him, he knew he was screwed. And not in a fun way, either. What started out as an excellent day seemed to have very quickly gone downhill. When that pink-haired girl took a seat right in front of the hole in the fence, a formerly most splendid view was reduced to nothing but an eyeful of cherry blossom hair. And when she turned around to look through the knothole only to see his eye, Jiraiya knew instantly that he'd been found out. It wasn't the first time he'd been caught peeping, and unless he died within the hour it likely wouldn't be the last, but the explosion that had followed her exclamation, water erupting into the sky as though gravity had been temporarily reversed, air screeching in his ears as a gale-force wind tore through the onsen, had been worrying. The shout that accompanied that violent event was even worse. He knew the voice well, even after all these years being able to identify it immediately, and the sound of it filled him with absolute dread. Considering that he'd almost died the last time he'd heard that voice filled with that much fury, Jiraiya could perhaps be forgiven for freezing up like a deer in the headlights. The divider being blown from its place and slammed forcibly into his face certainly didn't help matters. He'd flown clear across the men's side of the spring before he could even react. The fence splintered as he slammed into rock, and Jiraiya had just enough presence of mind to appreciate the terrible and yet glorious sight in front of him, before closing his eyes and praying it would soon be over. But then a small hand clapped on his shoulder, followed by a lurch in his gut as he was bodily dragged away at what felt like an incredible speed. Wind smacked his face and tore at his towel, G-forces squashing most of his internal organs down into the bottom of his abdominal cavity. If his mouth had been open, he probably would have swallowed a lungful of flies. For a single, terrifying moment, Jiraiya worried that Tsunade had spirited him away to be taken care of where no witnesses were present. Then he decided, a moment later, that she would have just beaten him to death where they stood, and damn the consequences. A second after being abducted from the onsen, Jiraiya was plopped down on the ground. And in the second and a half that it took for his eyes to reopen when he registered that he wasn't in any immediate danger of being painfully eviscerated, his captor was apparently able to return to the hot springs, retrieve their respective clothes, and then come back without getting so much as a single hair out of place. Not that anyone would have noticed, with that untidy golden mop. It took 3 seconds of staring to register that yes, those were Minato's eyes staring at him out of Kushina's face, Minato's hair and skin stretched over a distinctly Uzumaki bone structure. And the smile had a little of both, Kushina's brash and irrepressible mirth glowing with Minato's warmth and quiet confidence. He knew immediately who this was, standing in front of him and depositing both of their outfits onto the ground. There wasn't anyone else it could be. Such a powerful resemblance could only come from direct, immediate relation, and only one person in the world was so closely and equally akin to both Minato Namikaze and Kushina Uzumaki. "Naruto?" he said, frankly dumbstruck at running into the kid like this. "The one and only," the blonde cheekily replied. "Though a couple of people also know me as Menma. And you must be Jiraiya. I've heard an awful lot about you." "Ah, I see," Jiraiya mumbled, still a little bit in shock. He shook himself dry, and moved to put his clothes back on. "How much have you heard exactly?" "Kakashi-sensei mentioned that you taught my dad," Naruto replied, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "Who taught him, in turn?" A grin that showed far too many teeth. "Also, that you're my godfather. Me and my teammates may or may not have been plying him with liquor at the time." Jiraiya paused. "Yeah, I taught your dad, and your dad taught Tsukumo's brat," he said neutrally, sidestepping the comment about him being Naruto's godfather and pulling up his trousers. Then he hummed, thoughtful. "But Kakashi's your jounin instructor, huh? He must be teaching you kids all sorts of tricks." "Well, he is starting us on elemental affinities," Naruto said with a laugh, haphazardly tossing on his own clothes. "So I guess that's a thing." Jiraiya cocked an eyebrow at this. "Really? That's some pretty advanced stuff for fresh genin," he remarked, although he didn't say it with any particular hint of disapproval. "I suppose he's tested your affinities then?" Naruto nodded. "Sakura's got earth and water," he said matter-of-factly. "Dual affinities?" he said. "Wow, that's rare. What, does she have a bloodline limit or something?" "Or something," Naruto chuckled. "Not that it's really that impressive next to me or Sasuke, haha. He's got quintuple affinities." He paused, and stroked his chin. "Unless you count yin and yang too, but almost everyone can use at least one of those, can't they? So I don't think many people do." Jiraiya's eyes bugged out of their sockets. "Quintuple?" he exclaimed, immediately thinking of Nagato, the poor kid. "Yeah," Naruto said, as though this wasn't any big deal. "Claims it's because of that fancy eye he's got. That Rinnegan of his." Jiraiya felt like he must have been suffering a mild stroke at that moment. "I'm sorry, I don't think I heard you correctly," he said slowly, gaping in spite of himself. "It almost sounded like you said Finnegan." "That would probably be because that's exactly what I said," Naruto cheerfully quipped. "Not like it means all that much, though. He's still only the second strongest genin on Team 7. "What? The kid who apparently possesses a so powerful that the last man to wield it was considered a physical god is only the second strongest genin on your squad?" Jiraiya said disbelievingly. "What? Hell, Don't tell me that Sakura girl has Mokutan or something. Naruto waved a hand dismissively. No, just stupidly monstrous physical strength and a frightening aptitude for medical jutsu, he drawled. I, on the other hand, am pure awesome incarnate. A beat. Well, me and Kurama, he amended a second later, grinning sheepishly. Jiraiya blinked. Kurama? Yeah, though you know him as, wouldn't you? Or maybe Kyubi, if you're using it like a proper name or title or something. Naruto beamed. He's actually not that bad a guy, once you get past all the misanthropy and indiscriminate violence. You know, he hasn't called me a puny human in years? That's real progress. Jiraiya stared at Naruto, deeply perturbed. I see, he mumbled weakly, slowly shaking his head and taking a seat on the grass. Tell me, Naruto, does Kurama ever tell you to do things? Things you wouldn't normally do otherwise? Naruto scowled at this, as though reminded of an unpleasant smell. Well, he does nag me an awful lot about getting paperwork done on time, the blonde said, frowning. And he gets all fussy when I forget to wash my hands or brush my teeth. Says I'm already gross enough without adding bad hygiene to the mix. Jiraiya stared. Ah, he said. Ah, is that so? That's interesting. He paused, looking a touch anxious. Is there anything else? I dunno, Naruto muttered. He sometimes threatens to eat my soul and says he'll make me kill all my friends and burn down the village if I don't do as he says, but that's usually only when I forget to feed him. Never actually follows through on those threats, either. Jiraiya stared and stared, completely at a loss for anything else to say. Feed him? He said at last, continuing to stare blankly at the lad. What? Mostly fried tofu and inner zushi, Naruto elaborated, if perhaps not in the way Jiraiya wished. Though sometimes I'll get him a couple oxen or a brace of wild boars if he's been good. Jiraiya opened and closed his mouth several times, trying to say something but unable to actually formulate any coherent expression of his thoughts or questions. It made him look rather like a goldfish. And no, I mean what? How? Naruto stared at Jiraiya, looking at the man like he had just asked something patently absurd. What, isn't it obvious? No, Jiraiya wanted to say. No, of course it isn't obvious. But he couldn't bring himself to actually say that. It was just too surreal a conversation to try and approach logically, and his brain refused to even try and apply any sort of sense or reason to Naruto's statements. So instead he decided to try and steer the conversation in a direction where he could be the expert, and not the gawking imbecile. Yes, of course, he said, a mix of dismissive and evasive all in one. Well, if you're really on as good terms with Kurama as you say you are, then I suppose it should be safe for you to learn how to use it, his chakra. Naruto cocked his head to one side. I think I've already got a pretty good hang of that, actually. Sasuke and Sakura helped me out a lot with figuring out the specifics. And then he clapped his hands together, literally lighting up with a shroud of inhumanly dense chakra. The boy was clad in flames of gold, a raiment of light tattooed with arcane markings. Grass grew greener and springier at his feet, and the air tasted somehow cleaner, fresher, alive with something pure and primeval. Jiraiya blinked. Naruto smiled innocently. How's this? He inquired. How do you feel about toads, kid? Jiraiya asked. He hadn't felt this eager to teach someone since back when Minato had been his student. It seemed that, in at least one aspect, Naruto took after his father more than his mother. They're awesome, of course, Naruto glibly responded. Almost as great as hot babes. The grin that followed nearly threatened to split Jiraiya's face in half. I think we're going to get along famously, said the Toad Sage. Hopefully Kakashi won't mind me abducting you for a bit of private tutoring. I'm sure he won't, Naruto replied. Where on earth is Naruto? Kakashi wondered with a frown, sporting a heck of a shiner over his transplanted Sharingan and a sizable hematoma under his messy silver bedhead. He looked around in the onsen, swiveling his head this way and that as he scanned the waters for the short, cocksure blonde. An earthen barrier decorated with canine visages courtesy of the copy ninja split the men's and women's sides of the hot spring, functioning in lieu of the fence Tsunade had shattered. Several of the bathers on this side of the spring were dazed and glassy-eyed, either haunted or delighted by memories of Tsunade's brief rampage. Unlike Kakashi, most of them were physically untouched, the civilian bathers having been smarter than to try and get in the furious Kunoichi's way. Kakashi himself had only intervened out of reflex, and not any actual conscious decision. If he'd been thinking straight, he would have simply laid low and waited for the storm to pass. And all his attempt to stop Tsunade had really accomplished, anyways, was to mildly inconvenience the one-woman stampede for a second or two. Thankfully, Sakura and Sasuke had managed to pick up their sensei's slack and intercept the blonde ballistic missile before she could do any serious damage to him. Between a crimson look from Sasuke and a seemingly gentle touch from Sakura, the legendary Kunoichi was handily stopped in her tracks. If Kakashi focused, he could even now hear his female student on the other side of the impromptu nude divider, expertly soothing and defusing the pissed, hungover Tsunade. The only one of his students to have not played a role in stopping the furious woman's brief but devastating rampage was Naruto, who had seemingly vanished into thin air. Looking sidelong at the last Uchiha, Kakashi again idly wondered where Naruto might have gotten to in the few seconds of chaos that had erupted following Tsunade's initial outburst. It did not escape his notice that Jiraiya, whose peeping habits were responsible for the blonde's eruption, was also nowhere to be seen. This didn't necessarily mean that there was a connection, mind, but to completely dismiss the possibility would have been imprudent. He probably slipped away with his godfather, said Sasuke. He was boredly searching the water for his towel, which had come undone in the recent confusion, much to Sakura's audible delight/amusement when she saw it. I noticed they both vanished shortly after the fence came down. I doubt that's a coincidence. Kakashi sighed, wondering for the umpteenth time whether it had really been prudent to let that particular detail in regards to Jiraiya's relation to Naruto slip when he had. Yes, that does seem likely, doesn't it? He murmured. But it would have been nice to receive a heads up before he went and stole one of my pupils. I'd been planning on teaching him a new technique. And maybe Sakura, too. Sasuke gave Kakashi a look, arching one of his eyebrows. And me? You already copied my Raikiri, Kakashi said, sounding just a tad petulant. I don't even know how you did that, either, considering how much fog there was, but… He scowled and crossed his arms over his chest. Even aside from the fact that Sasuke had copied it at all, it was also a tad irksome that the boy could already perform the technique sans hand seals, and a seemingly indefinite number of times per day, at that. Kakashi was finding it surprisingly easy to understand why so many people had resented the Uchiha and the Sharingan, back before the night total annihilation of both. A scholar of literature probably could have written an entire essay on all the levels of irony of the copy ninja being annoyed over having his one, original, signature killing move copied by his own damn student, but Kakashi wouldn't have cared about that. He didn't much feel like being reasonable on that matter. Sasuke shrugged. My eyesight's better than yours, he replied dismissively. This was only a half-lie. With the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan and all the other hacks of his one-eye Rinnegan, Sasuke really did have an absurd degree of visual acuity, surpassed in range and insight only by masters of the… Of course, the real reason he could use his sensei's only original jutsu was obviously because he had learned it from the man himself more than 20 years ago. But the battle on the bridge, where Kakashi had employed that jutsu to counter and sunder Zabuza's executioner blade, pestered into pulling out all the stops so as to keep from being completely shown up by his students, had provided Sasuke with a golden opportunity to claim to have seen and copied it. A perfect excuse for being able to use the jutsu, which he could vaguely recall learning sometime not long before Itachi's return to Konoha. Some details faded with time, but Sasuke's memory of having his Chidori blocked and arm broken by his older brother was still quite vivid, a mixture of the Sharingan's eidetic memory, and the tendency of certain aspects of traumatic events to remain starkly clear in the mind even years after the fact. Humph. Well, whatever, Kakashi muttered peevishly, sinking back into the water. He sighed. If those two really did escape together, then I'd bet it's only a matter of time before Naruto guilts Lord Jiraiya into teaching him a few new jutsu, anyways. Look on the bright side, Sasuke said, gesturing vaguely with his one hand. If he takes over training Naruto for the Chunin exams, that'll leave you with more time to show me and Sakura some useful tricks. Kakashi huffed, still feeling a bit sore over possibly losing the chance to teach his sensei's son the Rasengan. In another time he wouldn't have been too bothered, having thought Naruto unprepared and too immature to learn such a jutsu so early anyways. But in this iteration he honestly believed that the kid was as ready as he'd ever be to learn his father's original technique. Sakura is a very bright girl, he muttered after a few seconds of bullheaded silence. I suppose she could probably manage something like the water dragon jutsu without too much trouble. And I did copy a fair few dotted techniques at the tail end of the war. And as for me? Sasuke prompted, eyeing his sensei expectantly. I've seen what you can do with that of yours, Kakashi flippantly replied, waving a hand airily. I'm sure you'll manage just fine with the skills you've already mastered. And it's not like you can't just copy any jutsu she might happen to use later on. Sasuke shrugged. Fair enough, he conceded. But it's not like you wouldn't do the same, if you were in my position. Kakashi did not dignify this with a response. What the fuck is wrong with these Konoha bitches? This thought echoed through Temari's brain, a statement of her disbelief more than a genuine inquiry, as she stared and watched one of the other genin kunoichi to advance to the finals calmly and nonchalantly talk down a homicidal, hungover Tsunade. Yes. Tsunade. Of the goddamn Sannin. Who had been screaming threats of murder and mutilation at a man named Jiraiya. A name that all too often went together with those of Tsunade and Orochimaru in the history books. Myobokuzen no Gama Sannin, as he was said to introduce himself. Too much of a coincidence to actually be an effing coincidence. At least Temari now knew why the woman's face had seemed so vaguely familiar. The Slug Princess was still listed in Suna's bingo books, and Chiyobu-sama had certainly told her and Kankuro enough rambling tales about her old rivalry with the legendary sucker to make certain details stick. It took her a moment of silent thought and a slightest hint of growing dread to appreciate the fact that no less than two of the famed Sannin seemed to be present in Konoha, and not a month before the long-planned invasion. An invasion she was distantly aware to have planned between her father and the rogue third member of the Hidden Leaf's most legendary trio. Temari was probably in a state of mild shock, standing there in the hot spring and staring at that pink-haired little freak of nature who had beaten Kankuro in the preliminaries. A rosy-tressed little medic ninja who had shrugged off the puppet expert's poisons like they were nothing and thrown him into the far wall just by flicking him on the forehead, and who now was in the process of patiently soothing a seething Tsunade, looking for all the world like she had done this a million times before. She wasn't entirely certain what, exactly, to think about this, but the general impression was pretty clear. Temari had thought that Lee Kid seemed absurdly fast and strong, but what she'd just seen from Tsunade's conniption fit had made the bull-cut taijutsu freak look slow and feeble by comparison. For goodness sake, the woman had practically upended the entire onsen with a single punch. The bow wave from her fist had split the waters like a Red Sea, and the shock of her knuckles impacting the divider was felt in the bones of everyone present. Some of the smaller civilian women in the bath had been sent flying clear out of the water, and the towels of those who'd been closest to Tsunade when she snapped were hanging off of their frames in tatters, tossed and buffeted about by nothing but the sheer air pressure from her swift and violent movements. Temari couldn't say for sure what was scarier. The fact that the woman had done all of this without even apparently trying, or that she'd so easily flown into a murderous rage. Temari didn't much like the idea of being peeked at by some shifty old pervert, either, but Tsunade's reaction to the revelation of a peeping Tom had been terrifyingly disproportionate. If that was how the woman reacted to someone peeping on her in the bath, who was to say what she'd do in response to an offense actually deserving of violent retribution? Like, say, her home village being invaded by traitorous allies? Temari would not want to be present to witness such an event. And for the first time, she felt truly appreciative of the orders Baki-sensei had relayed to her and her brothers only a few hours earlier, just before the start of the surprise preliminary round. Remember, until such a time as you are instructed otherwise, you three are to act under the assumption of continuing to honor our village's treaties with Konoha. Respect the local authorities, and do nothing to provoke unnecessary conflict or hostility. Kankuro had been visibly perplexed by these seemingly redundant instructions, and Gaara hadn't looked like he was paying attention at all, but Temari got the subtext. Especially when Baki then added, Lord Kazekage has seen fit to indefinitely postpone all of your previous standing missions for the duration of our time here in Konoha. Be grateful. It was an ambiguous enough statement to not draw any undue suspicion from those not in the know, but clear enough also to be understood by those with the proper background information. Heaven only knew why their father had made this decision, but Temari and her brothers had only one standing mission that could be indefinitely postponed, the role which had been planned for them to play out in the invasion of Konoha. And considering the fact that Gaara's part in the plot was kind of seriously crucial to actually pulling the whole thing off, there was only one conclusion she could draw. New intelligence must have surfaced which put the integrity of the operation into serious question, intelligence worrisome enough to warrant potentially calling off the whole shebang. Intelligence, for instance, such as the presence of 2 of the legendary Sannin in Konoha, just hanging around in the village for no apparent reason. That would certainly be a big enough factor to potentially make it too risky to go ahead with the invasion plans. Temari could appreciate that, especially after seeing what one of them could do without even trying. I am so glad I don't have to live with these crazy freaks, she decided. They make Gaara look almost normal in comparison. And that was the scariest thing she'd thought in years. When Shizen awoke to a throbbing headache and a pair of arms wrapped around her waist, she wasn't sure whether to feel glad or dismayed. On one hand, considering that she was lying naked in an unfamiliar bed with a warm and distinctly male body spooning her, the heretofore ruefully single woman was secretly feeling a hint of cautious elation. Her aunt, Charge, and mentor may have been content to live the life of a bachelorette wandering from town to town in a drunken haze, but Shizen had lately become increasingly aware of the fact that, in close to 25 years of life, she herself had not once had any kind of serious romantic relationship. She wasn't a little girl anymore, and all those years she'd spent traveling with Tsunade, focusing so heavily on just looking after the older medic and making certain she didn't get herself into too much trouble, had done very little for Shizen's personal life. Just being able to wake up in a stranger's bed after a night spent drinking felt strangely freeing. For once, she'd had a chance to forget about being the responsible one and actually have a good time herself. All thanks to being back in Konoha. On the other hand, however, considering that she was lying naked in an unfamiliar bed with a warm body curled up behind her, Shizen also felt more than a little embarrassed. She had no idea who the person spooning her was, and while she may not have been at all averse to the thought of hooking up with a nice, handsome fellow, she wasn't half so desperate for a meaningful relationship as to hop into bed with the first guy to offer. At least, she hoped she wasn't. But she'd seen firsthand what alcohol could do to the judgment of even very intelligent and respectable people, and there was no guarantee that the man embracing her was someone she would have any serious interest in while sober. Hesitantly, gingerly, Shizen pried the hands off of her waist and inched a little towards the edge of the bed. She pulled the covers off of herself and sat up, turning hesitantly to glance at the man whose bed she was sharing. For a moment, she just looked and stared at the dusky complexion, brown hair, scarred nose, and peacefully sleeping face. She drank it all in, feeling a twinge of appreciation. He was handsome, she noted, in a non-threatening and almost boyish sort of way, with lips that looked well-suited to smiling, and a toned but lean musculature which seemed to hint at a possible shinobi background. Cheeks grew warm after a few moments of staring at the man, and Shizen abashedly tore her gaze away before it could drift too far south. "Well, he definitely looks very nice," she murmured to herself. And trying very hard not to look back in her bedmate's direction, she cast an eye around the room in search of her clothes. Hopefully Tsunade-sama hasn't gotten into too much trouble while I was away, she thought, reaching up to snag her panties from the ceiling fan. Though I'm sure she won't be very happy when she realizes where we are. She spared another glance for the man she'd apparently slept with and smiled a touch guiltily as her gaze wandered more freely over his form, ruefully thinking for the briefest of moments that maybe she shouldn't have left her mentor all alone at that inn, because who knew what sort of trouble the woman might be getting into. Naturally, Iraka chose then to wake up and open his eyes to see Shizen standing over him in the buff, her dark eyes glued half longingly and half regretfully to his naked body. It was terribly awkward for both of them. It was to gray skies and a light drizzle that Itachi Uchiha awoke that morning. His eyes opened and he sat up, rising into consciousness with an uncanny ease. He was instantly alert, though not tense or nervous. Quiet confidence was mingled with just a hint of clear caution. No cue of drowsiness or stupor was there to be seen in his visage as he arose from his sleeping bag, dressed ready for a fight, shooting coolly wary glances hither and yon. He stood and swept up his sleeping bag with a single fluid motion, packing it automatically and mechanically. Languidly he assessed his surroundings, analyzing and mentally cataloging every tiniest detail with sharp crimson eyes. Rain clouds drifted overhead, casting a dismal pall over the lowlands of river country. Wet and runny ashes, the only remnants of a smokeless cook fire from the previous night, were washing away in tiny rivulets. A damp, pervasive chill hung in the air, numbing fingers and stiffening joints. Small and beady eyes greeted the Uchiha's rising, pale blue lips curling into a sharp-toothed smile. "Did you have a good night's rest, Itachi-san?" Kisame Hashigaki politely inquired. The serenity of the man's expression evoked an eerie dissonance as he stroked the death's head pommel of a thickly swaddled great sword, the picture indicative of an eldritch disconnect between his monstrous visage and courteous mien. "Good enough," Itachi curtly replied. "How did your watch go?" "Well enough," Kisame answered, wryly mimicking Itachi. "This is a quiet country, and nothing much comes out in this sort of weather besides. Samahata and I haven't caught a whiff of anything larger than a squirrel all night." The shark-like man patted the hilt of his gigantic weapon. Itachi nodded, wordlessly showing his understanding. Silence reigned between them for a minute or so as one sat and waited for the other to finish cleaning up his half of the camp. "Have you eaten yet?" the raven-haired youth asked at length, once he had sealed away his sleeping bag and combed the site for any overt traces of their presence. Water dripped from the rim of his straw hat as he adjusted it on his head. "Just a food pill and the last piece of venison jerky," said Kisame. "We should still have a few pounds of dried fruit and plenty of other rabbit food, though, unless you've been doing a bit of midnight snacking during your watches." Itachi hummed and nodded. "Yes, that sounds about right. Those supplies should be more than enough to last us until we meet up with our client," he said. "Even discounting the food pills." "Ah, yes. Our client," Kisame heartily chuckled, standing and slinging Samahata over his shoulder. "It has been quite a while since I've done a straightforward escort mission like this. And to the Chunin exams, of all destinations." He grinned, showing off a considerable number of teeth. "Quite generous of the old fellow, really. Wouldn't you say? Especially when he could have contracted a team of ninja from his country's own hidden village." "We're cheaper," was Itachi's response, terse but accurate. Shrugging, Kisame turned and started off, knowing that his partner would catch up in just a second. "Do you suppose there will be any talents worth scoping out at these exams?" the former Miss Jounin wondered. "I don't think I have been to one since my own." Itachi was quiet. It was clear from context and his knowledge of Kisame's personality that by talents worth scoping out, the man meant people who might be worth fighting at some future point in time. Unbidden, Itachi's mind went to the contents of a certain letter, drawing up from memory the date of a certain function announced therein. He thought of his little brother, whom he had spared from death what felt like a lifetime ago, and who had seemingly sent him that very letter quite out of the blue. "Maybe a few," he said ambiguously. Kisame grinned, spying the pensive look on his partner's face. Is that so? Then perhaps this one genin team I've heard about will be there," he mused. "Do you remember them? Those children who supposedly sent my former colleague, Zabuza-san, slinking back to Kiri with his tail between his legs." Itachi looked off into the distance. The wind shifted, rustling their cloaks and flecking their faces with a light smattering of cool raindrops. "Ah, I believe I know who you're talking about," he decided to say. "That's the team with the Kyuubi. Their Jounin sensei is Kakashi Hatake, my captain for a while, back when I was in ANBU." Kisame's smile widened and became caught, but two opposing rows of teeth filed to unnaturally sharp points. "Oh, is that so?" he murmured, dark eyes glittering with mirth. My, it sounds like this will be a most entertaining diversion." "Yes," Itachi murmured absently. "Yes, so it does." Hanabi Hyuga adored her big sister. This was a simple, indisputable fact, as sure and self-evident as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. The grass was green, the sky was blue, and Hanabi admired Hinata. She loved her sister's kindness, how Hinata would play with her even if she was exhausted from training, how Hinata would listen to her childish worries and give her reassurance. Her sister was strong, and almost always had been in Hanabi's eyes, no matter what other clan members may have thought in the past. Her sister was brave and gentle and pretty, and so kind. And so strong. Hanabi had always believed her sister was amazing, that Hinata Hyuga was a remarkable person. She had always admired her, had always looked up to her and hoped to one day be every bit as wonderful a person as she was. Only once or twice had that childlike faith faltered, but every time her beliefs had ultimately been vindicated, at least to her young mind. In this instance, however, something was different. For the first time in a long while, Hanabi's belief in Hinata's strength was mirrored by the rest of the clan. Hinata had irrefutably proven, the day after her graduation, just how amazing a kunoichi she really was. At the time, Hanabi's faith in her sister's strength had begun to falter. She'd seen Hinata fall short in spars against Niji Nizan, and even lose in a fight against herself as well. Her, Hanabi, a girl several years Hinata's junior. It had shaken her worldview to realize, seemingly, that her sister was in fact weak, and that many among their clan viewed Hinata as unfit to assume a leadership position. While being passed over for the spot of clan head would not result in anything like getting bound with the caged bird seal, that being applied only to sons who could actually traditionally start branch families of their own, and to their children, it still seemed to Hanabi as though being passed over like that would have been a dreadful thing to happen to anyone, let alone her big sister. And for a while she'd ruefully, worriedly, regretfully thought along similar lines to the other clan members, although she still dearly loved her sister. Hinata Nisama was still Hinata Nisama, whether weak or strong, but it had nonetheless felt disappointing in a way, to think that she had surpassed her sister like this. That victory in their spar had felt hollow, tasting like ash in her mouth. Hinata could have won, should have won. She was more experienced, after all, stronger and faster than her baby sister, but she had been unable to follow through on the opening she had created, reluctant to strike her beloved sibling, even in a mere practice fight. And for a while, Hanabi had foolishly bought into the assumptions of the other clan members that this kind-heartedness, this nature of gentility and gentleness, somehow proved Hinata's weakness. That because Hinata had been unwilling to hurt her baby sister, she must have been inadequate and incapable, insufficiently skilled to carry the mantle of the Hyuga clan's leadership. But then came that fateful day, the day when Hinata Nisama proved her strength beyond any shadow of a doubt. Hanabi had seen her sister from afar that morning, awoken from her slumber by screams and crashing noises. What she saw, when she dared to peer out her window, utterly awed and amazed her. Hanabi Hyuga beheld her sister storming determinately out of the compound, brushing aside dozens of full-grown branch house members, each one of them a proven and experienced shinobi, like they were but minor nuisances. Hanabi recognized scarcely half of the strikes her sister used, and she gawked in dumbstruck wonderment as Hinata completely humiliated skilled and able-bodied ninja up to twice her size and thrice her age. With this single spectacle, Hanabi Hyuga's faith in her elder sister was restored and redoubled. Starry-eyed, she had watched her sister punch through the outer wall of the compound without even touching it, inwardly gushing and squeezing with relief, vindication, and a tiniest hint of shame for ever having thought to doubt her sister's prowess. Since that day, Hanabi's admiration for her sister had only grown. Where most of the other clan members, even her own father, to a certain extent, respected Hinata only with an equal measure of fear, Hanabi saw no reason to shy away from her sister, or cower in her presence. Whether weak or strong, Hinata Nisama was Hinata Nisama. Nothing could ever change this. Much though certain people might have wished otherwise. Niji Nizan, Niji Nizan! Hanabi cried out excitedly when she saw her cousin come walking into the clan head's house, doubtless to give a report on his progress in the Chunin exams. You're back. Did you see my sister? How is she? How well did she do? Is she a Chunin now? Are you a Chunin now? She chattered away until she was breathless, firing off this rapid barrage of questions in her excitement. She hadn't seen Niji or her sister in nearly a week. And sure, Niji had been gone for similar lengths, once or twice, on a C-rank mission with his team, but the longest Hinata had ever been away from home had been 2.5 days, when she and her team had gone to take care of a troublesome boar on the outskirts of a rural farming village. A whole week of separation seemed nearly unprecedented to young Hanabi. Niji blinked, staring blankly at his cousin. Legal cousin. Genetically a half-sister, since their fathers had been identical twins, but no one really counted that. But he stared at Hanabi, and his mouth creaked halfway open as if meaning to speak but unsure of what to actually say. He wasn't entirely certain how to approach Hanabi, for a variety of reasons both obvious and more subtle. Being reminded of Hinata and the Chunin exams made him think of her fight with Tenten in the preliminaries, which caused him to recall that his female teammate had been snappish with him all day, ever since his attempt at reassuring her after her defeat had backfired. And remembering this fact after having tried rather hard to forget it over the past several minutes stirred a strangely uncomfortable sensation in his gut, a sort of faint tightness in his chest, and an ill humor at the back of his mind. His lips threatened to twitch downward in a scowl, and only a near absolute control over his facial expressions on Niji's part managed to keep it from actually forming. Dimly, he wondered why it irked him as much as it did that Tenten wasn't speaking with him at present. Might it be that he felt a certain camaraderie with her, as the only other seemingly sane member of Team Guy? Shaking his head, he discarded this train of thought. Hinata-sama was well, the last I saw her, he finally said, looking Hanabi mostly in the eye. His glance was a tiny bit off to the side, but otherwise it seemed sincere. And no, none of us are Chunin just yet. There's still one final phase to the exams, but that won't be for a month. There. That should be enough information to satiate the girl. Inwardly nodding to himself, convinced that he would now be able to go on his way unmolested, Niji turned and continued further inside, only to be stopped by Hanabi's hand on his arm. He flinched at the touch, a reaction obvious enough for even an untrained civilian to notice. Hanabi seemingly ignored it. "How did she do?" she asked, reminding Niji once again of Hinata's match with Tenten, and the subsequent situation that had occurred between himself and the brunette as a result. Superbly, he said, only half more than growled, unable to keep a slight trace of bitterness out of his voice. Hanabi eyed him strangely at this remark, no doubt catching his less than pleased tone. For a moment he got the impression that the younger girl was about to make some insightful remark on his apparent bad mood, wondering perhaps if there might not be a very particular reason, aside, perhaps, from the rather obvious, that Hinata doing so well in the Chunin exams should upset him. An Odango-haired, female reason, perhaps? She didn't, thankfully. At least, not in the way that a small part of Niji secretly feared. "Ah. Did you fail the exam?" she asked, about as tactful as you could expect from a kid her age. Which wasn't very. Niji's face colored the slightest bit, and this was all the answer Hanabi needed. There were times that Yugao sincerely regretted joining the ANBU. Certainly, it was great to serve the village from the shadows and eliminate its enemies under the guise of anonymity, and all that. Yes, she was proud to put life and limb on the line for the sake of the Lord Hokage and the village as a whole, but the work was hardly all sunshine and daisies. Sometimes, all too often, it seemed, she had those days where it felt like she would have been better served just staying at home. Like the night after the Uchiha massacre. God, that one had been a waking nightmare. There were some things no man, or woman, should have to see, and the bloody aftermath of young Itachi's rampage had to be right at the top of that list. Or maybe that one mission in the capital, when she and her team had busted those human traffickers. Or perhaps deposing a genocidal regime in that one impoverished, war-torn nation. It still made her sick to her stomach to think about what some people were willing to do for a quick buck, or a little power over their fellow man. Simply despicable. But today. Oh, today. This, right here, had to be one of the worst missions she'd ever been forced to accept. It may not have been dirty, gruesome, or involved in any significant way with the really more abominable aspects of human nature, but it was still more humiliating and degrading than even the sleaziest of seduction gambits. "Would you mind repeating that, ma'am? What exactly happened in your inn's hot springs? You said something about an explosion, correct?" Yugao Yuzuki, feeling more thankful than ever for the relative anonymity afforded to her by the porcelain mask of her ANBU uniform, held a pencil and notepad in hand as she took the innkeeper's statement. The Okami was a stooped and wizened thing, half blind, to judge by the way she was squinting, with graying hair tied up in a heavily dated fashion, and a well-kept but nonetheless very old yukata hanging off her frame, once vibrant colors now faded into a near monochrome after decades of wear and washing. Opposite this diminutive, elderly matron, Yugao must certainly have looked like some faceless sentinel of almighty bureaucracy, sword in sheath and pencil in hand. She most definitely felt the part, much though she wished otherwise. With the Chunin exams in full swing, she and most of her fellow ANBU had been assigned to patrolling the village, doing rounds and keeping the peace. No exciting missions for them, no. Nothing but day in, day out plotting the beat, breaking up fights and escorting drunks to holding cells. Despite Konoha being a ninja village populated primarily by individuals who were emotionally iffy at the best of times and capable of countless fantastic, frankly absurdly destructive feats, it was actually very boring most days. Like 85–90% of the time, there was never anything of note happening. Even on many occasions when it seemed like there might be something interesting about to go down, it usually turned out to be just as dull and unremarkable as everything else. Yes, it was like an explosion, said the innkeeper, gesturing vaguely with a gnarled hand. I could feel the earth shaking from inside the kitchen, and the noise, it was deafening. A great, loud boom. The whole shook from the force of it, I tell you. Yugao nodded, absent-mindedly taking notes, as she thought of the nice, quiet night she had planned for her and her boyfriend. Imagining how Hate would react to seeing her in that barely there teddy he'd gotten her was just about the only thing giving her the will to carry on through the day's mind-numbing tedium. I see, said the Violet mechanically. Do you know if anyone was injured, or what exactly might have caused this explosion? No one was hurt, said the Okami. I don't believe so. I haven't been back there yet myself, since the explosion, but a few of the bathers have come in since then, and none of them looked any the worse for wear. Only a couple of bumps and scrapes among the whole lot. You don't say, Yugao muttered, tapping her pencil on the notepad. Have any of them said anything to you about the incident? The innkeeper frowned thoughtfully at this question. She nodded silently after a moment. 1 or 2 customers did come to me with complaints of a peeping Tom and some drunk having a bit of a shouting fit on the women's side of the springs, she said, but I don't see how there could be any connection between the explosion and that. Yugao's sweat dropped, immediately making the obvious connection. In the back of her mind, she wondered if the innkeeper might not be getting a touch senile in her old age. This was a ninja village after all, and already it seemed obvious to the ANBU operative that this whole kerfuffle had probably just been caused by an unstealthy pervert and a violently shy kunoichi. Nothing suspicious or out of the ordinary there, unfortunately enough. Sighing, she put away the notepad and headed in the direction of the onsen to find the persons responsible for disturbing the peace and bring them in to be dealt with appropriately by the civil authorities. A dreadfully dull task for a member of the Konoha Black Ops, hardly challenging or engaging no matter which way you cut it. Sure, it had to be done, but necessity rarely made things more enjoyable. If only something interesting would happen, Yugao thought as she stepped through the door into the hot spring. Like a good old-fashioned murder mystery, perhaps, or a plot to embroil the hidden leaf in war. Oh, that would be simply swell, wouldn't it? Much more exciting than this, at the very least. It was with these wistful thoughts of more interesting happenings running through her mind that Yugao Yuzuki surveyed the women's side of the hot spring. She curled an eyebrow under her mask at the sight of an earthen wall dividing the onsen in place of the customary wooden fence, and found herself mildly surprised to recognize Kakashi's handiwork there. The dog faces were a dead giveaway. She also took note of some superficial damage to surrounding structures, and saw that the perimeter fence looked like it would probably need a fair few repairs, although it was still standing and in one piece, more or less. Not even bothering to make her body language seem at all authoritative, Yugao assessed the lingering bathers and noisily cleared her throat. Ahem. She faked a cough, casting a disinterested eye over a handful of young girls, one a sandy blonde, another somewhere between blue and black, and a third with blindingly cherry blossom pink locks. She also took a moment to espouse the familiar visage of Genjutsu Mistress Kurenai, who looked like she was willfully and wearily closing her eyes to whatever may have been happening. The last woman of note was another blonde, and a very surly-looking one at that. She was red-faced and droopy-eyed, with brown eyes and enormous hands. Yugao frowned at the sight of the woman, her expression going unseen. Despite being in a bath at this very moment, this woman seemed to have something oddly untidy and disheveled about her appearance, something in the glaze of her eyes or the smell of cheap sake on her breath, which could be detected even from across the onsen, albeit very faintly, that instantly caused Yugao to peg her as the purported drunk. She looked once more at the other bathers, who had all turned and now gave her their mostly undivided attention. Then she blinked, looking back at the hungover-looking blonde. She stared for 3 seconds. She looked back at the others. Blinked once, looked back at the blonde. Behind a porcelain vizard fashioned in a vaguely animal likeness, Yugao's mouth went slack. Huh! She said blankly, staring at the distinctly recognizable visage of the most legendary kunoichi to ever come out of the Hidden Leaf Village. Why? Tsunade frowned at the ANBU operative who was standing just inside the entrance, near the edge of the spring where the stones were smooth and wet. What are you looking at? She rumbled, arms crossed above her chest. Yugao blinked, suddenly regretting her wish for something interesting to happen. It was easy to piece together the gist of what had happened, knowing now that Tsunade of the Sannin, of all people, had been in this very hot spring when it happened. Ere she was frozen for a moment, uncertain what to say. Most citizens would comply meekly if told by an ANBU to come with them, and usually those who didn't were relatively easy for the elite Black Op agents to subdue. But taking in someone like Tsunade, well, that was far, far, far above Yugao's pay grade. She had no illusions that she'd be any match for the legendary medic. ANBU were good, but not that good. It had been quite a while since Yugao had felt this intimidated, least of all in her own village. Tsunade narrowed her eyes. I'm not coming with you, she said flatly. I didn't do anything wrong. Yugao wanted to curse aloud at this statement. Yes, be that as it may, she murmured. Well, there was a disturbance reported here at this onsen, and it's my duty to find out the cause of it. That's easy, Tsunade said flippantly. It was a peeping Tom. That damn Jiraiya. Yugao nearly choked on her tongue at this. Not at the revelation of the Toad Sage's voyeuristic habits, which were well known to most Leaf Kunoichi over a certain age, but the fact that he was here in the village at all. Tsunade was right there in front of her, and Jiraiya had been here too. Sage, Christ, and Buddha. All they needed was Orochimaru, and they'd have the goddamn trifecta of what the fuck. On a private beach in the Crescent Moon Kingdom, a man in a Hawaiian shirt sneezed into his martini. Taking a deep breath to keep from losing her shit, because seriously, the presence of two of the legendary Sannin in the village at the same time was big freaking news, Yugao calmly and collectedly took out her notepad and pencil, and began to write. Jiraiya-sama, so he was the one responsible for the explosion. It was his fault, it had to happen, yeah, said Tsunade, eyeing the ANBU agent suspiciously. If he hadn't been such a pervert. Yugao resisted the urge to sigh. It had to happen. Would you mind elaborating on that? She requested. Tsunade glowered, but did as she was asked. He was peeping on us, so of course I got angry. Like any good citizen, I was made to apprehend him and give him a good scolding. The blonde scowled darkly. But he got away before I could catch him. Yugao felt a bead of nervous sweat form on her brow. I see. So, in the process of trying to apprehend him, did you do anything that might have caused damage to the onsen? She cautiously inquired, wary of invoking the medic's legendary wrath. Like, for instance, to the divider? Humph, Tsunade harumphed. I might have thrown it at him, but I hardly see how that's relevant. Shouldn't you be tracking him down? I don't think he's the one responsible for all this damage, Yugao said delicately, gesturing at the splintered and barely standing perimeter fencing, the spiderweb cracks in the stone tiles, and the considerable volume of water which looked to have been splashed everywhere but the spring, dousing every surface in sight and leaving the onsen barely 2/3 full. Are you really suggesting that I'm the one who will get into trouble for this? Tsunade growled, her voice low and dangerous. She made to rise from the bath, but a hand on her shoulder from the young pinkette managed to cool her down, or at least somehow restrain her. We'll be sure to handle Jiraiya-sama appropriately, Yugao said coolly. However, the matter of the damages incurred here is rather more serious. You may very well have to pay a rather hefty fine for disturbing the peace, on top of financial reparations to the Kikushidare-in. Tsunade stared uncomprehendingly. What? I'm sure it was very distressing to be peeped on, Yugao said appeasingly. But one offense does not justify another. You will have a chance to argue your case before a judge, I am sure, and Lord Hokage himself might want to handle this particular incident, considering the circumstances, but if you cooperate now, we might be able to work out a plea bargain. Tsunade blinked. Her jaw was agape, and her eyes looked nearly as wide as dinner plates. The other bathers present seemed variously interested, even Kurenai cocking an eyebrow at the boldness of this ANBU. Not many people would have the balls to try and put the screws on one of the Sannin like this. The young pinkette seemed to lean in and whisper something reassuring to Tsunade, who let out a weary, long-suffering sigh in response. Yugao, herself, was just praying to God that this would work. She knew that if Tsunade tried to resist arrest there was not a damn thing she'd be able to do about it, but she could hardly just turn and look the other way. This was the Slug Princess, the most famed medic ninja in the world, and one well known to have been avoiding Konoha like the plague for over a decade. Honestly, by this point all of her legal talk was just a pretense to get Tsunade before the Sandaime. It was practically her civic duty to ensure that Tsunade stayed in the village for as long as possible. If the woman had to be reconscripted into the hospital under the guise of community service, then so be it. Well? Yugao asked. What do you say, Tsunade-sama? The blonde slowly shook her head and laughed, appearing grimly amused. You clever bitch, she murmured, eyeing the ANBU operative with the slightest hint of something like respect. A sigh. Fine, whatever. I should have known something like this was bound to happen sooner or later. She stood up and got out of the bath, sparing an unreadable glance for the pinkette who'd been beside her. A young girl Yugao recognized as the Hyuga heiress went to the slender lass's side. Well, let's go see what Sarutobi-sensei wants, Tsunade muttered, sighing and shaking her head. Hell, with my luck this'll have all been orchestrated by Shizen in some wild plot to get me to come back here for that blasted family reunion. Sandaime stared blankly, seated in his office atop the Hokage Tower. Blink. Blink. Tsunade had her arms crossed over her chest, stubbornly looking at the wall to her left, refusing to meet her old teacher's gaze. Yugao had already left the office at Hiruzen's request. He'd thanked the ANBU agent for bringing this matter directly to him, and then dismissed her and told her to take the rest of the week off, maybe spend some quality time with her boyfriend. Hokage's orders. The master and pupil were in silence. The office was empty save for these two, sunlight streaming in through the window. It was a tense atmosphere, like a spring compressed in someone's hand. Things were still and silent for the moment, but it couldn't last. Sooner or later something would give, and then the shit would hit the fan. The sighed. He rested his chin on folded hands and closed his eyes, losing himself in rumination for a brief moment. Tsunade fidgeted, feeling like a naughty schoolgirl sitting before the headmaster. And not in the sense Jiraiya would use in his novels either. Even now, with his former students over 50 years old, Hiruzen Sarutobi still had a knack for making at least some of them feel like foolish children. Neither one spoke for several seconds. They just stood there, or sat, in the Sandaime's case, and waited. For what, either could really say, but they certainly weren't just procrastinating. No, perish the thought. They were just waiting for the right moment. Yeah, that's it. Waiting. After a seeming age of quiet, however, one of them finally broke the silence. So. Yeah. Perhaps not an especially eloquent or Shakespearean dialogue, but it was something. It didn't convey any great meaning between them, or even begin to cover all of what they felt needed to be said, but at least it was a start. You're back in Konoha, Hiruzen said, eyeing Tsunade curiously. That's new. I could have sworn you said what, that you would never come here again even if it was the last civilized place on Earth. To be fair, I didn't realize where I was until like half an hour ago, Tsunade responded evasively. And I'm sure I was drunk when I said that. I was definitely drunk when I came here. Yes, you were, Hiruzen agreed solemnly, recalling the night in question when a grieving Tsunade had finally snapped and stormed out of town with her kid niece in tow. Almost he imagined he could still detect lingering, stale traces in his nostrils of the alcoholic reek which had clung to her at that time. Very drunk. For a moment, another awkward silence stretched out between them. Tsunade broke it with a sigh. I suppose you plan on charging me with property damage? She said wearily. Maybe disturbing the peace, too. I could feel the vibrations from here, Hiruzen remarked. Idly he fingered his pipe, smokeless and unlit. I have considered it, yes. Tsunade, for her part, had the decency to at least look the tiniest bit contrite. You know I hate that kind of thing, though, she muttered, toeing the floor and scowling. Jiraiya had it coming. Indeed. I will not insult your intelligence with a lecture on shinobi ethics and the illusory nature of privacy in a ninja village, said the Sandaime patiently. But you did still react in a manner disproportionate to the offense. Again. He got better last time, Tsunade replied, sounding a bit defensive. Eventually. And that was decades ago, anyways. Do you really need to bring up ancient history? Her face colored a shade darker as she said this last bit. Hiruzen silently curled an eyebrow, almost as if to say really? You know what I mean, she added in a huff. I'm older and wiser now. I wouldn't beat him anywhere near as badly if I caught him. Is that so? Her old teacher wondered. Truly? Tsunade shot a black glare at him. I'll admit I should have controlled my temper, she said through gritty teeth. I'm a grown woman and should know how to handle such matters civilly and responsibly. There was no call for me to do all the damage I did, or to get other people wrapped up in it. But I'll not be talked down to, Sarutobi-sensei. He folded his hands and nodded. Fair enough. You know what you did wrong on that account, and you have acknowledged as much. That's good. But I'm sure there's more you want to talk about, Tsunade sighed. She narrowed her eyes. Right. Her mentor smiled wryly. Indeed there is, he said. A great deal more. Leaning forward over his desk, the Lord Third looked directly into his old pupil's eyes. His lips twitched at the corners and he threaded his fingers together. An empty pipe dangled from his mouth. He spoke, his voice low and scarcely above a whisper. What would you say to take on a new apprentice? Achoo. In the women's changing room at Kikushidare in Enonsen, Sakura abruptly sneezed while pulling up her panties, losing hold of the garment and dropping it around her ankles. Gesundheit, said Hinata, absent-mindedly fastening her brow. Sakura sniffed and rubbed her nose with the corner of the damp towels she'd been wearing. She blinked, her eyes watery. Thanks, she said, smiling lopsidedly at the Hyuga. I hope I'm not coming down with anything. Hinata nodded her agreement, then bent over to pick up the underwear Sakura had dropped. Here, she said. Do you need any help with that? No, I'm fine, Sakura said. Thanks for offering, though. Kurenai watched the two girls interact with a small, nostalgic smile on her face. Almost reminds me of myself and Anko, when we were that age, she thought. Summoning Jutsu. Naruto's proclamation rang sharp and clear. He clapped his hand down on the grass. The toad summoning scroll lay off to the side at Jiraiya's feet, a new signature drying on the ancient paper. Chakra tingled in the atmosphere, thick and rich and laden with vitality. Pop! Air was displaced with a burst of white smoke, the blood offering from Naruto's thumb opening the doorway for an animal familiar to pass from Mount Myaboku to the hidden leaf. Jiraiya watched appraisingly as the smoke cleared, revealing a small toad of ruddy orange coloration. Yo, boss! Gamakichi greeted his summoner with a wave of his webbed forelimb. What can I do you for? Then he blinked. He stared at the person before him, perplexed. That was odd. Humans looked more or less the same to him, but Gamakichi was still pretty sure that Jiraiya didn't have blue eyes. Or blonde hair. And the Toad Sage didn't usually go for such bright orange shades in his clothing either, did he? Oh. Duh. This wasn't Jiraiya. Eh? Said Gamakichi confusedly, cocking his head to one side. Hello? Who are you, bro? Naruto Uzumaki, said Naruto, holding a hand out to the young toad. It was weird to see his old familiar so small. He was used to being able to ride on Gamakichi's head, but at their current sizes it would be easier for Gamakichi to ride on his head. I'm new, I just signed the summoning contract. We'll probably be working together for a long while, you and me. Gamakichi blinked again, before giving an amphibian grin and clasping the index finger of Naruto's proffered hand. They shook, the motion looking rather odd on the human's part. Yo, Naruto! Nice to meet ya! Said the toad cheerfully. Gotta say, I'm a bit surprised Jiraiya actually let someone else sign the contract. Pops ought to be glad to see some new blood though. How'd you get that old miser to let you sign anyways? Haha, well, it's kind of a long story, Naruto said, chuckling sheepishly. He coughed into his fist, not so subtly changing the subject. Familial obligations and all that. But putting that aside, well, I'm sure it will be an honor to work alongside the Toad clan of Mount Myaboku. He bowed briefly, before looking back up with a toothy grin. I hear you guys have some pretty incredible ninpo. Gamakichi laughed. What, you mean our Toad-style senjutsu? He wondered, scratching the back of his head. Yeah, I suppose that's something neat by human standards, isn't it? Though it's the norm for us. Reckon I could try teaching ya, but Pops might get fussy about that. He doesn't like any old outsiders just learning our techniques, why see? He then cocked his head to one side, spying Jiraiya standing off to the side and watching his and Naruto's interactions. Oh. Yo, Jiraiya, he called, waving to the Toad Sage. How you doin'? Jiraiya returned the greeting with a small grin, waving to the young and irreverent summon. Fine, he said. Could probably be better, but I've just been catching up with my godson. If this statement surprised Gamakichi, the Toad didn't show it. He just laughed and turned back to Naruto. Huh, I see. So you're Yandame's kid? Naruto smiled. You're the first person to actually come out and say it straight up, the blonde commented, silently thinking the words this time around. But yeah, I am. Well, now, ain't that something? Gamakichi crowded, hopping once in place. Pops has told me stories about your old man. Says the fourth Hokage was the only human he ever respected enough to consider his superior, haha. Jiraiya's left eye twitched, the man looking irked at this implied dismissal of himself as a summoner worthy of respect. He crossed his arms peevishly. Yeah, I've heard a lot of good stuff about him. People see him as some kind of hero for saving the village, I guess, Naruto said with a faint shrug. I dunno, apparently that's sort of a big deal or something. He grinned, and Gamakichi laughed. Heh. I like you, bro. The Toad decided. You're a real funny guy, you know that? I've always thought so, yeah, although some people don't appreciate my brand of humor. Naruto waved a hand airily. They got all pissy when I defaced the faces, and called me a pervert when I used my sexy jutsu on people. I mean, sure, I am something of a perv, but so are the people those jutsu work on. Gamakichi cocked his head curiously. Jiraiya also looked a bit intrigued by this comment, wondering perhaps what it could be referring to. Sexy jutsu? He parroted curiously. Yeah, Naruto said. It's my pride and joy, you know? My own original finishing move. And saying this, he struck a pose. The ultimate forbidden technique of the Naruto Uzumaki Ninja Handbook. My ninpo are some of the most fearsome jutsu in all the elemental nations. He wove a ram's seal and focused his chakra. See? Like this, he declared before disappearing in a puff of smoke. Pop! A slow, seductive, jazzy theme might have been playing in the background as the smoke cleared. Jiraiya couldn't be sure. All he saw was that vision of erotic perfection. From her smooth, soft skin free of blemishes and shaded a healthy athletic bronze, to her hair, silky and luscious and sun-kissed gold-colored, worn in cute twintails, she was absolutely flawless. Her calves and underarms were smooth and shapely, swelling and tapering in just the right places, and with just the right proportions. Her body was soft and curvaceous, with a good and toned physique underneath. Lean, corded muscle could be made out across her body, if only in the subtle ways that it shaped the softer, more yielding tissues layered atop it. Her thighs, her shoulders, and her lean, flat abdomen were all perfectly enticing, lewdly drawing one's gaze this way or that, perfectly framing and accentuating the most bountiful and sensual parts of her anatomy. Her posterior was goodly sized, round and bountiful. The curvature of it, in profile, flowed truly lasciviously from the small of her back down onto her thighs, flowing like a river into perfectly toned and proportioned legs that seemed to go for miles and miles without end. Her bosom, meanwhile, was even more generous. Her breasts were big, bordering on cup sizes a quarter of the way through the English alphabet, yet also perky. While definitely looking every bit as soft and heavenly as one might imagine with their size, they did not seem to droop or sag at all. Jiraiya marveled at those beautiful bunkerbusters. The way they jiggled and heaved, bouncing and bobbing to and fro as the blonde smiled and bent over to wink at her captive audience only made the sheer size of those tits seem even more ungodly salacious. It took the man a moment to realize that this was a henge. A gorgeous, busted, weaponized blonde bombshell of a henge. Sexy jutsu. Blood erupted from his nostrils like a geyser, and Jiraiya flew through the air with 2 thumbs up and a grin from ear to ear. Beautiful. Simply beautiful. The silence was deafening in Irika's kitchenette, an awkward wordlessness pervading the atmosphere. Whirring and bubbling, a coffee machine dispensed its bitter payload into a waiting pitcher, the only sound audible apart from the refrigerator's dull electric hum. Irika foraged anxiously through his pantry, looking uncharacteristically disheveled in just shorts and an undershirt. He was blushing something fierce and doing his damnedest to avoid looking into the adjacent dining room of his modest 1LDK, avoiding the conflicted and uncertain gaze of the lovely young woman he had woken up to this morning. Or afternoon, to be more accurate. My, and wasn't that just the most mortifying part? Irika could not remember the last time he had ever slept so late, being an ordinarily firm believer in the age-old adage of early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. He hadn't done something like this since before he'd become a Chunin instructor, at the very least, and probably not for even longer still. Of course, Irika didn't usually go out drinking either. But the other academy teachers had roped him into it. A celebration of the youngest and most greenhorn leaf genin squads making it past the second stage of the Chunin exams, they had called it, convincing him with some effort to come along and join them. After all, was that not an occasion for merrymaking? They had taught those rookies, and now at least some of those kids were on their way to becoming Chunin before even spending a year as genin. Was that not an extraordinary event worthy of much fanfare and wassailing? So they poked and prodded Irika into coming along and having a few drinks. He could remember bad music and worse karaoke, cheap booze and many toasts. To health. They'd raised their glasses several times, to teachers and students. To the Chunin exams. So on and so forth, they had gone, coming up with increasingly contrived excuses to clink their cups and down more shots. To pretty women in slinky dresses. One of the older bachelors among their number had cheered, leering companionably at a fairly tipsy Suzume-sensei. To cute young men in tight jeans, she'd cheerily rejoin, winking at her boyish 19-year-old teaching assistant. Too cheap booze, one of the drunker teachers interjected, raising their own glass. A strong economy and good exchange rate, another chortled. To surplus harvests and, cute farmers' daughters, crowed the first. So it had gone on and on, degenerating from there further and further into debauchery, excess, and minimum wage hedonism. Irika could hardly remember anything of the night past the 2-hour mark. Nothing except a lonely-looking face and a rare, bold feeling of confidence welling up in his chest. Quite frankly, Irika was just thankful that today wasn't a school day, or he and his colleagues probably would have earned themselves some very serious lectures from the Board of Supervisors. He especially, considering how late he'd awoken. Which brought him back to the matter of what, or rather, who, had woken him. Thus his thoughts came full circle, and he was left no recourse but to ignore everything and hope it went away. With a soft groan, Irika removed the pitcher from its niche and poured himself a hot cup of joe. Ugh, how drunk was I last night? He heard his surprised bedmate mutter. I don't know how she can stand to do this all the time. This piteous moan came from the dining room, reminding Irika of his lovely and unexpected house guest. His cheeks burned hotly, the young man immediately recalling the very first thing he'd seen upon waking up that afternoon. It had truly been a wonderful view. I wouldn't know, Irika said, trying to distract himself from thoughts of naked flesh. I can't really remember what happened at all last night, really. It was a very eventful evening. Don't think about sex. Don't think about sex. Don't think about sex. Yeah, I'll bet it was, the woman said almost absent-mindedly. She sounded a tad disappointed. But you don't remember anything then? Not even, how did we got into bed together? Or, what came afterward? Anne and I just thought about sex. Damn it. Irika blushed a vibrant, rather striking shade of scarlet. No. I only wish I did, he blurted out, failing to censor himself in his pre-coffee state. It would still take several minutes for the caffeine to kick in, so there was a moment of awkward silence before he actually registered what he'd just said. You know. So I could, He heard a squeak, and a moment later his guest started to stammer. WWL, I don't blame you for wishing you could remember, she nervously babbled. I can't really recall what happened last night either. A pregnant pause passed between them, lasting several seconds. She broke it hesitantly, with a mumbled, say, do you suppose it was any good? Irika jumped. This question so startled him that he nearly dropped the sweetener into his coffee, packet and all. What, the sex? He asked unthinkingly, replying before he could measure his statement. He heard a thump and a crash from the dining room, sounding almost like someone had jumped, fallen, and tipped the table. Yes, came his guest's voice. The Sue's SSS6. Well, Irika flushed deeper and scratched the back of his neck. Do you take milk or cream with your coffee? He asked, not sure what to say in response to a question like that. Could he really be honest and say he had no idea, because it wasn't like he'd ever actually had sex before? Cream, she said, and he heard her grunt, and the sound of something heavy being shifted. Air, and 2 sugars. Will artificial sweeteners do? He asked, taking an anxious sip from his own coffee. My sugar's buried kind of deep in the cupboard. Sue sure, she answered. That sounds good. He felt himself blush at this word, as though it had suddenly taken on a very dirty meaning from the context of their prior discussion. Would he ever be able to say good again without thinking of her question, and the circumstances which prompted it? Or perhaps the phrase would forever become associated in his mind with the flash of her naked body, the reddening of her face, the widening of her eyes as she watched him blink and realized that he was awake and looking right at her. Yes, he said, gulping. Good. The word even felt dirty coming in his own mouth, and Irika felt embarrassed to say it. With one simple inquiry, it seemed that this woman had forever tainted one of the most common and innocuous of words, making it sound so lewd and indecent to Irika. Clumsily, the Chunin shook his head, as though the motion would somehow send all these confusing thoughts tumbling out of his brain, and grabbed another mug, completely plain, eggshell white, and a thing of creamer. Steam rose from the coffee in sinuous tendrils as he poured it, something about the shape of the ascending wisps bringing to mind long and slender legs, smooth and firm with a tempting softness, the contours which climbed all the way from dainty little toes to a lovely pair of. Irika slapped himself, preempting his thoughts right as they were about to plunge headlong into the gutter. Are you okay? That accursedly pretty woman called, a hint of slight worry in her voice. Of course she could hear him. Yes, I'm fine, he called back, grabbing a packet of sweetener next. It was nothing. Really? Her voice came, sounding unconvinced. I thought I heard. It was nothing, Irika insisted. I just slipped a little bit. Oh, she said. Well, be careful then. Don't hurt yourself on my account. Irika blushed, feeling almost more flustered by this simple show of concern than by any recollection of bare skin and supple curves. I will, he mumbled, tearing open the packet and dumping the non-sugar into the coffee. No need to worry. He swillied the mug's contents with a stir, feeling hesitant to head into the dining room. Idly, he realized that he didn't even know this woman's name, or at least he didn't remember it. It felt entirely surreal to think this. He had woken up naked next to a woman whose name he didn't even know. Heaven above, that made him feel absolutely awful. Just thinking about the mere idea of it left Irika feeling guilty, as though he had done her an inexcusable disservice. Feeling painfully aware of the fire in his cheeks, Irika reluctantly took the mug out to his guest. He noticed that the table was arranged differently than it had been when he went into the kitchen, and its position appeared to have been slightly altered. Here you go, he said distractedly, setting the coffee on the table in front of her. Be careful. It's, hot. Despite the mussy state of her hair, the bags under her eyes, and the fact that her clothes were dirty, disheveled, and smelling strongly booze, something about the woman before him left Irika feeling butterflies in his stomach. It might have had something to do with the fact that he could still vividly remember the sight of her standing above him, stretching in her birthday suit to reach a pair of panties that were dangling from the ceiling fan. The woman smiled appreciatively, lopsidedly, and blew once on the mug's contents before taking a sip. Thanks, she said. I appreciate the hospitality. Irika blushed and coughed into his fist. Why, you're welcome, he told her, scratching his cheek. It's nice to have company. She stared intently down at her coffee, and he saw her face flame up at his words. I see, she said awkwardly. That's nice. You have a nice place. A pause. The flush in her cheeks spread further, painting her entire face a bright scarlet. I don't think I know your name, she said, and the look on her face made it clear that this was very embarrassing for her to confess. Sorry. Irika laughed sheepishly. Hey, no, that's okay, he told her. You're not the only one. Swallow. You don't remember your name? She asked him, blurting it out. And no, I know my name, Irika said, sweat dropping. I suppose I worded that poorly, my fault, sorry. She looked at the wall to her right, the flush crawling swiftly down her neck. Irika watched her spreading, deepening blush with a hint of fascination. Oh, she said lamely. Oh. Yeah, okay. That makes sense, guess I wasn't thinking clearly. Don't worry about it, Irika said, fidgeting nervously. Neither of us is at the top of our game right now. He looked down at his shorts and undershirt, feeling extra conscious of his state of dress. I'm a mess, she groaned miserably. I look awful, don't I? Of course not. Irika immediately replied, the force of this statement surprising even himself. He flushed. I mean, you just haven't had a chance to wash up yet. He trailed off. She fidgeted self-consciously. I'm sorry, she said. This is so awkward, I've never really been in this kind of situation before. I have no idea what the right thing to do is. You and me both, Irika sighed. Geez, I'm sorry if I've been making you feel uncomfortable. And no, I'm fine. She yelped, nearly jumping out of her seat. I'm perfectly fine, it's not uncomfortable or anything. I just, don't have experience with this sort of thing. Me neither. To be honest, Irika gulped. I have no idea what this means. Where do we even go from here? Neither one of us remembers a thing about last night. She fiddled with a stray lock of hair. I don't know, she said. Where would you want it to go? I mean, I know we were drunk, but this is still the first time I've ever, I woke up in bed with a man. Ah, Irika said. So you were also, He fidgeted. She blushed. You too? She asked. I'm surprised. Why, yeah, he said. I'll admit I'm a little surprised that you are, too, a pretty girl like you. A silence. Oh. She squeaked. You mean you think I'm? You are, he said, his face a deep shade of red. But I'm sure you hear that all the time, Her expression brightened, a small smile gracing her lips. It's Shizen, she told him softly. And I suppose I've been told that before, but fidget. Being flattered by drunks and perverts just doesn't feel the same. I suppose it helps that you haven't once tried to, grab me since you woke up. He scratched his cheek. I see. That's a nice name, Shizen. It suits you. He smiled, absent-mindedly rubbing the scar on the bridge of his nose. You can call me Irika. Oh, is that a code name? She asked, seeming to relax a little bit. If it is, then it got assigned to me awfully early, he answered. But no, it's just my name. Irika Yumino. She took another sip of her coffee. Do you go by a different name on the job, then? She asked half-jokingly. No, he said, waving a hand in the air, smiling sheepishly. Sorry to say I'm just a run-of-the-mill academy instructor, nothing especially impressive. Shizen met at this, looking absent-mindedly thoughtful. So you're good with kids, then, she found herself murmuring. Maybe. Irika laughed, slowly loosening up. I suppose so, although I seem to have a knack for attracting the most disruptive troublemakers to my class. Haha, I guess it's probably penance for all the hell I put my own teachers through. I'm sure you were a sweet kid, Shizen said. I really wasn't, he told her, shaking his head in spite of a grin. It makes me cringe to think about all the mischief I used to cause, especially now that I know what it's like from the other end. And just what sort of mischief did you cause back in the day? She asked coyly. Irika blushed and scratched the back of his neck. Oh, all kinds, he said. I was a real nightmare in those days. But then I suppose we all were, in our own ways. He trailed off with a shrug. Well, I'm sure you know how it was, after the attack, he said. I was just a kid when the QB came, but I'm sure that's not something we need to talk about right now. He waved it off. I suppose you'll want to use the shower? I really need it, she answered, nodding. Any preference about when you want to go? He asked. I should probably have a quick shower, myself. He stomped down the tiny, damnably incorrigible voice that told him to share, not knowing or guessing that Shizen was repressing a similar impulse at the exact same moment. That was probably for the best. Sasuke sighed long-sufferingly as he approached the dango's shop. His eyes were glaring holes into the dirt road, his face a mask of suppressed irritation. This is irksome, he thought to himself. Naruto and Sakura are both making inroads with their former mentors, while I... He scowled. Most assuredly, Naruto had to have signed the Toad summoning contract by now. And even if he hadn't quit yet, he was sure to do so during the final phase of the Chunin exams. Sakura, too, had begun to establish a rapport with Tsunade, and with her luck was bound to be taken under the woman's wing sooner rather than later. This bugged Sasuke a little more than he was happy to admit. Mostly because he didn't want to have to hold back the better part of his arsenal in the final phase, when it came time to fight Naruto. And they would fight, so help him, even if Sasuke had to personally move heaven and earth just to make sure no one interfered. While he could always fish a copy of the Hawk summoning contract out of his clan's storage, Anso Kamaru and his avian kin would not make for an appropriate matchup against one of the Gama clan. It wouldn't feel right. If he and Naruto used summoning jutsu in their match, and they probably would, if they had to refrain from using their favorite trump cards of Perfect Susanoo and Bija Sage mode, considering the restrictions of the far too small arena they would be duking it out in, Sasuke wanted it to be a reasonably fair fight. Which meant he would need the snake summoning contract. It just wouldn't feel proper, otherwise. Unfortunately, the route via which Sasuke had originally obtained the snake contract was presently unavailable to him. Perhaps for good, if Orochimaru vanishing to the furthest edges of Naruto's maximum sensory range was any indication. So that was kind of a problem. Fortunately, his wife had pointed out a possible alternate route to getting his signature on the Ryuchi Cave contract. Unfortunately, however, the way in which Sakura had suggested for him to convince Anko to train him was, well, undignified, to say the least. Anko-san is also a snake summoner, isn't she? You could probably get her to teach you, if you put your mind to it. And it seems like she's taken a shine to you in this timeline too. You could probably appeal to her vanity, by pretending to have a crush on her. And she is a very striking woman, isn't she? I'm sure it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to imagine you having a mild infatuation with her, dear. And she'd winked while saying this, too. Sometimes, a part of Sasuke longed for the days of the slavishly obsessed fangirl Sakura who would have never thought to look at another man. Or maybe the later, violently possessive girlfriend Sakura who probably would have brutally murdered him at the slightest hint that he might even jokingly entertain the notion of possibly someday looking at another woman. Then he'd stop, sigh, and admit to himself that, truthfully, he wouldn't trade the playful and open-minded wife he had now for the world, even if she did like to tease him more than his pride would have preferred. Turnaround was fair play, he supposed, and it was admittedly fun for him as well, when they were alone. It was kind of ironic how the girl who used to follow him around like a lost little puppy was now probably the only woman alive with the raw force of will and sheer determination to tame the henceforth untamable Sasuke Uchiha. Or maybe appropriate. Possibly funny. Sasuke was not an expert on literary terminology. But either way, Sakura did have a good point. As usual. The Uchiha coughed into his fist as he crossed the threshold of the dango shop, spying his target languorously slouched over a plate heaped high with sweet, skewered dumplings. With a mixture of acting skill and the remembered sensations of the woman slyly pecking him on the cheek while certain other things pressed into his back, he willed his face to color a slight pink. Every aspect of his behavior from that point onward was carefully calculated, each slight tremor of his voice and shift of his glance carried out with precise deliberation. He made a point to glance at her chest as though unable to quite help himself, darkening his cheeks a shade further before jerking his head up. He fidgeted and mumbled and consciously failed to completely look her in the eye, hesitating just long enough to make it seem natural, stumbling over his words in such a way as to emphasize nerves without too greatly diverging from people's perceptions of himself. Like a proud but flustered tsundere, Sasuke looked away and cut himself off at points, blushing and continuing shakily, conspicuously editing his tone and words accordingly in line with the mood and context. A good ninja had to be a good actor, and he wasn't considered the best for nothing. He introduced himself awkwardly, making a show of anxiety in how he greeted Anko, clearing his throat and making it look like he was trying to uphold his pride even as he confessed something embarrassing. Very few people could see through his acts. Naruto was one, and Sakura another. Hinata could also penetrate his less subtle facades, although the better ones tended to trip her up. It took a close and intimate understanding of his personality to know exactly when he was putting on a show and when he was being genuinely sincere. And that's the way it was with most people, really. Sasuke's talents for the pretensions of everyday civility were simply a little more advanced than most. Excuse me, Anko-san, was it? He inquired, flushing and mumbling a bit. Hi, I'm Sasuke. Do you, remember me? Anko looked up from her dango and eyed Sasuke curiously. She smirked a tad at the sight of his apparent. Yes, she said wryly. I'm Anko, and Anko means me. And I don't know about any Sasuke, but I do remember a cute little twerp with some decent skills outside the forest of death, though he still managed to get all embarrassed over a tiny bit of physical contact. Heh. She chuckled, eyes dancing with amusement. Sasuke's hand twitched to his cheek, the side of his face where Anko had planted that playfully chaste and teasing kiss. His blush became a little more genuine, as he noted a hint of the slightest and most general apparent similarities between Anko and Sakura. A scary thought if there ever was one. Why yes, well, he stammered, looking away from Anko and making a point to seem like he was resisting the urge to look more southward of her face. Well, that was, a surprise, and it sort of, caught me off guard. I see, Anko said, grinning from ear to ear. So you find yourself feeling confused and intrigued, do you? You really are just an innocent little brat. No need to feel ashamed though, kid. It's only natural you'd become infatuated with a babe like myself. Sasuke's sweat dropped at the immodesty of this statement. You sound awfully sure of yourself, he mentally tsukomied, biting back the urge to make a sarcastic retort. I'm not an impressionable little boy who gets a crush on any halfway attractive woman he sees, you know. That's more Naruto than me, really. Out loud, however, where others could see and hear him, Sasuke simply cleared his throat and tugged at his collar. Do you really think so? He asked, cheeks reddening. Humph. Well, I don't know where you got that impression from, but it's not like I've got a sea-crush on you, or anything, he mumbled, fidgeting. Anko chortled and clapped a hand down on Sasuke's shoulder, yanking him into a crushing one-armed hug. Sasuke winced, and not just from the rough noogie she proceeded to give him, or the relative proximity of his face to her bosom. Now, Anko said, wagging a finger. Don't lie, kid. I can tell just from the look on your face that you've got it bad. The curse of being beautiful. She sighed theatrically. Sorry to break your heart though, but while you're a cute little twerp and all, I'm just not into that kind of thing. Sasuke squirmed uncomfortably in Anko's arms, making a conscious effort to restrain himself and not accidentally break out of her grip. Ooh, I see, he said, feigning disappointment. That's well, okay. I guess I understand. Don't feel bad, Anko cheerfully reassured him. That teammate of yours is pretty cute herself. You make a nice couple with her, I think. Even if I were interested in you, I wouldn't want to break that up. She chuckled. Probably. Sasuke gulped. Why yeah, he murmured. Sakura is really Say no more. Anko laughed. I can tell what it is. You want to impress her, don't you? Now that you know this little crush on me won't be going anywhere. Sasuke said nothing. He could tell that he didn't need to. Well, I usually stay out of matters of the heart, but you're an amusing kid, so I suppose I could make an exception. Just this once, you understand. She clapped him on the back. How does that sound, eh? Big sis Anko will teach you all about how to make your teammate fall for you. Slowly, hesitantly, Sasuke voiced the inquiry. In what way? Anko made a show of thinking. Well, I don't know much about romance, honestly, she confessed. Never really bothered with all that lovey-dovey stuff. But if there's one thing I do know, it's how to kick ass. You're going to train me in that way? Sasuke asked, guessing that it would be best to voice the question. Wouldn't that be considered a conflict of interests? Do I look like I care about that boring legal crap? Anko retorted. The only reason I even passed out those liability waivers at all was because the other proctors had been riding my ass about it. Sasuke murmured, I see. A beat. So, I hear you can summon snakes, he mentioned casually, reckoning that there was little point to beating around the bush anymore. Meh, it's a thing, I guess, Enko replied, shrugging. I don't really use it for much more than Sanaijishu, though, most of the time. Not like I've got any particular sentimental attachment to it. Not since I was a kid. Another pause, carefully timed, waiting for just the right moment to strike. Sasuke hesitated deliberately, posing his next and final question in a very specific tone and timbre. Could you teach me? Enko grinned. Sure, why the hell not? That ought to put a bee in the old bastard's bonnet. So saying this, she released her hold on Sasuke and let out a borderline maniacal laugh. And on a certain beach in the Crescent Moon Kingdom, Orochimaru sneezed yet again. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this what if, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember even shadow clones need love. Peace out, Shinobi!